So today's video is going to be part 2 to my previous video on the serial killer named Jerry Brudos, better known as the shoe fetish slayer or the lust killer. If you didn't catch part 1, you do kind of need to watch that one first, so I'll leave it up here in the eye. Go click on that, watch that one, and then come back here for part 2. Just a couple of things before I do get into this case. The face coverings on my merch store are back in stock. You guys sold these out over the weekend, which is amazing. Thank you so much. But I know a lot of you wanted to get them and couldn't get a hold of them because they sold out. So they're back on sale now if you do want one. Along with the rest of my merch, everything is still available at eleanorneale.shop. The link is in the description and right here. But before we continue with this story, I just want to thank Care Of for sponsoring this video. Care Of are a US-based vitamins and supplements company. They only ship to the US and Canada right now, so I'm sorry if you're elsewhere, but I know most of my audience are American these days. I love Care Of because basically what they do is give you a curated daily vitamin and supplement pack that targets exactly what your body needs more of. All you have to do is go to their website and fill out a quick 5-minute survey about you, your diet, your lifestyle, your health goals, and they'll figure out, based on that, exactly what vitamins and supplements you need more of in your diet. And then they send you something like this, a cute little tower with these little vitamin packs in. You have one of these every day. Don't worry, these little vitamin packs are compostable. If you want to know how to compost these little packets, you can go to this link. Care Of has all the instructions on their website, and in these little packs are basically all the vitamins that you need to take that day, and it just basically saves you having like 10 different tubs of 10 different supplements and like popping one out of every single tub every morning. It's all in these little daily packs. Some of the vitamins that Care Of recommended for me personally include vitamin D because I work from home, so I'm not gonna lie, I don't see as much of the sunlight as I probably should. I have one for my energy levels. I have keratin for my nails to keep my nails strong. I have one for my eyes because obviously I work on a computer all day, so I need to look after my eyes. So if you guys want to go and take Care Of's quiz to find out what vitamins and supplements they recommend for you personally, they are kindly offering you guys 50% off of your first month if you use my code, which is just Eleanor. Thanks again to Care Of for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into it, I'm just going to give a little bit of a summary of what happened in part 1, so then you're all caught up. Jerry Brudos grew up in Oregon. Neglected and abused by his mother, he was constantly shamed for having normal and natural sexual urges. He took a particular liking to women's high-heeled shoes and underwear. However, due to the way that his mother would treat him whenever he would express his interest in those things, he always thought they were very shameful, and these urges were not normal and they had to happen behind closed doors. And this led to Jerry committing actual crimes in order to fulfill his sexual urges that he was having. And these crimes would include theft, assault, sexual assault, even abduction. Jerry is now in his early 20s with a wife named Darcy and 2 children. However, lately he feels as though his wife has been neglecting his needs, and so he sets out to fulfill them elsewhere. So where we left off part 1, Jerry had began going out on an evening and stealing women's underwear from their washing lines. And it was even getting to the point where he was breaking into women's houses so that he could go into their drawers and get their underwear out himself if it wasn't outside on a line. And on this particular day, Jerry Brudos sets out to go and stalk women around town, as he often did. He would go out, find a woman that he thought was attractive, and he would just follow her around all day until she'd finished in town, and then he would go home. However, this time, he found a woman that he thought was attractive, but he knew he didn't want to just leave it there. He didn't want to leave it at just the stalking. He wanted more than to just steal her shoes or her underwear. He followed this woman all the way back to her apartment building. He followed her home, but instead of going inside with her, he hung back and waited outside, watching the building to see which window was hers. He waited until he could see her turn the light on and walk into her apartment, so he knew exactly which one was hers. And then Jerry Brudos hung around for another few hours until he was sure that she would be asleep, and then he approached. He broke into this woman's apartment and began looking round for some high heels or some underwear that he could steal, but in the process of doing that, he actually woke the woman up. And Jerry was in her bedroom. And as soon as Jerry realised what he'd done, that he'd woke this woman up, he knew that he had to act fast. He had to do something. And so without thinking, he impulsively just jumped on this woman and strangled her into unconsciousness. Now, Jerry had done this once before. Well, a couple of times before. He'd physically assaulted a woman while he was trying to steal things. But this time, Jerry Brudos took it a step further and he raped this woman while she was unconscious. And in that moment, something clicked in his brain. He got full satisfaction from this attack. He never felt completion with his attacks, and this time he did. And that made him realise that it wasn't the intimidation or, seeing the fear in his victim's eyes. None of that was what did it for Jerry. What helped him achieve full sexual satisfaction, he realised, was that the woman was unconscious, that she was unresponsive. He liked that part. And in that moment, Jerry Brudos realised that he was a necrophiliac. That was exactly what he wanted, was to have sex with unconscious, or preferably for him, dead women, deceased women. And this took Jerry back to those fantasies that he used to have when he was young, where he always used to want that dungeon of women, and he even started digging it in his garden, and then he realised it was too big of a project. Only now he took that fantasy and turned it even more twisted in the way that he wanted this dungeon full of women, but the women would be dead. And in an ideal world, if he could get away with that, Jerry wanted to do that. He would imagine having a full freezer, like a walk-in freezer, full of dead women's dead bodies, and he could just take any of them out at any time whenever he wanted to use them. And this fantasy only got stronger and stronger as the days went on. On January 26th, 1968, 19-year-old Linda Slawson, an encyclopedia saleswoman, knocked on the door of Jerry Brudos' home. And it was Jerry Brudos himself that answered the door that day. And when he did, Linda started her usual pitch trying to sell these encyclopedias. Now, Jerry really did not care about encyclopedias, but he listened anyway, and when she was done, he was like, yeah, I'm interested. If you want to talk more about it, come inside. So she did, and he led her down to the basement, which he said was like his kind of workspace in the house. Meanwhile, his two children and his mother were upstairs. So Linda sits on a stool in Jerry's basement and he sits opposite her, and they're talking about these encyclopedias, and then in the middle of the conversation, Jerry gets up on the pretense that he's just going to go pick something up behind Linda. But when he got there and she wasn't looking, he picked up a plank of wood and hit her over the back of the head with it. Linda fell to the floor and Jerry knelt down next to her and checked for her pulse to see if she was still alive, just unconscious, or if he'd actually killed her with that blow. And she was alive. She did still have a pulse. But at this point, that wasn't enough for Jerry. Jerry grabbed the unconscious Linda's neck in his hands and squeezed as hard as he could. He said he could even hear the bones cracking in his hands. And he did this until he was sure that Linda was dead. And when he let go, Jerry Brudos had just claimed his first murder victim. He moved Linda's body under the basement stairs because if anyone was to catch him off guard, open the basement door, or, even walk into the basement, they might not see it if the body was slightly hidden. And once he'd got the body out of the way, he ran back up the stairs into the rest of the house and asked his mother to take the children out for food because they hadn't had their dinner yet. But of course, that was to just get them out of the house so that Jerry could run back down to the basement and continue with the aftermath of his murder, because he didn't kill for the reason of killing. He killed for the aftermath. First, he undressed Linda until she was completely naked, and then he went out and got his collection of stolen women's underwear and high heels, all those things that he'd been stealing for most of his life. He then dressed her up in pretty much every single garment that he had, just to see what he liked the best on her body. And whenever he found a set of underwear that he particularly liked Linda in, he would take pictures of it. And he did this with quite a few different underwear sets. And as he was doing this, Jerry realised that he had never been more satisfied. He'd never been happier. He wanted to keep Linda's body forever and do this every single day, but he just couldn't. The risk of someone finding her was way too high. Of course, he'd have to keep her in a freezer. The freezer in their basement just was not big enough. And even if it was, there's always the risk of his kids or his wife coming down and opening that freezer to get something out and seeing a human body in there. He realised that he just couldn't keep this body and it needed disposing of as soon as possible. And so instead, he decided that he would keep a trophy from the body if he had to get rid of the rest of it. And so Jerry Brudos took a hacksaw, sawed off one of Linda's feet, and kept it as a trophy. Because that's the only part of the body that he's really interested in. He loves high-heeled shoes. He'd stolen so many high-heeled shoes over the years, and now he finally had a foot to model them. Jerry Brudos then once again hid the body under the basement stairs before his family got home, because if one of them opened that door, they would see it straight away. He then waited until the middle of the night. He got up and left his wife in bed. When he knew that everyone was asleep, he went down to the basement and put Linda Slawson's body in his car. And Jerry knew exactly how he was going to dispose of this body. He was going to drive to a bridge rather close to his house, actually. And when he got there, he pulled over onto the roadside and got a spare tyre out of his car, so that if anyone was to drive past, he would just look like he was, trying to change his tyre. But of course, he wasn't changing a tyre. What he was really doing was tying a heavy object like a car engine to Linda's body, so that when he threw it over the edge of the bridge into the water below, it wouldn't rise to the top. And after just a few months, as Linda's dismembered foot began decaying in Jerry's basement, he realised he no longer wanted it anymore. And so he drove out to that same bridge and threw her foot over that same railing that he'd thrown her body over. Of course, within a day or two of Linda's disappearance, her family and friends noticed that she was missing. However, her work colleagues just assumed that she'd quit. Her job as an encyclopedia saleswoman was a rather temporary job for people that worked it. It was one of those things that you came into when you needed the money and you would leave when you found your kind of career path that you actually want to be on for the rest of your life. So all of her colleagues just kind of assumed that she'd left and found another job in an area that she actually wanted to progress in. But when her family and friends hadn't heard from her in a fair few days, they decided to go to the police and file this as an official missing persons report. And so searchers began to try to find 19-year-old Linda. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of his first ever murder, Jerry Brudos was on a high that he'd never felt before. He'd never felt so much satisfaction from an attack before, and he knew that he didn't want to stop there. Later that year in 1968, Jerry Brudos was 29 years old and he decided to move his whole family once again. They moved around a lot whenever Jerry would get a new job. However, this time he decided to move them to Salem, Oregon, which is where he'd grown up, where he'd spent most of his life. And it was there where he would commit his second murder. 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney was a college student driving home from visiting her friend one night on November 26, 1968, when her car broke down in the middle of the road. A couple of guys pulled over on the side to help Jan sort out her car. However, it was clear that she needed a new part to be able to fix it, and neither of these men had this part. However, then another person pulls in, and in this car was Jerry Brudos. Jerry took a look at Jan's car and said, "Yep, I know exactly what to do to fix this, and I have that exact part at home. I just need to run back and pick it up." He offered to bring Jan with him to go pick up the part, as well as those two men that had stopped to help. So all four of them got in the car, and then those two men felt as though the situation was solved and this guy was going to go get the part, so they just said, "Okay, you can drop us off at home and then you two can go get the part. So Jerry dropped these two guys off at home, and it was just him and Jan in the car, and they go back to Jerry's home to get this car part. So they pull up onto the driveway, and when they do, Jerry realises that he doesn't have his house key on him, and he's like, oh, do you mind waiting until my wife gets back? She's got the only house key, so she can unlock the house for us, then we'll get the part, then we'll go fix your car. And Jan was happy to wait. This man was going to fix her car for her for free. So she was like, yeah, fine, whatever. So the two of them just sat in the car on the driveway and talked for a while. So the two of them are talking for a while, and then Jerry turns to Jan and says, do you want to play a game? And she says, okay, what's the game? So Jerry says to her, I bet you can't explain to me how to tie a bow without physically showing me what to do. So just with words, you've got to teach someone how to tie a bow. And Jan agrees to play this game, and so Jerry goes and gets in the back of the car so then he can't see Jan's hands, and Jan begins explaining to him how to tie a bow. But of course, Jerry Brudos had other plans. As soon as he got into the back of the car, he grabbed a leather strap, wrapped it around Jan's neck from behind, and pulled on it, strangling her until she stopped breathing. And when he was sure that Jan was dead, he dragged her body into the garage of this new house. Of course, he had a key this whole time. That was all just a lie to keep her in the car. And in there, he undressed her, raped her lifeless body, and then dressed her up in his collection of stolen underwear. Once again, he tried on all these different underwear garments on her and took pictures of her in almost every single one. And once he was done, he hung the body up from a rope pulley that he had in this garage, so a suspended rope from the ceiling, and he left Jan's body hanging there for days while he committed repeated necrophilia on her. He even left Jan's body hanging from this pulley in the garage while the whole family went away for Thanksgiving. And he just left a dead body in the garage. Once they returned home from Thanksgiving, Jerry decided it was probably time to dispose of this body, otherwise it was going to start decaying, it was going to start smelling. But not before he took his own trophy from his second victim. He decided to cut off one of Jan's breasts, and then he disposed of the rest of her body. He attempted to preserve this breast that he'd taken as a trophy. At first, he tried to kind of encase it in resin, but that didn't work. Resin is kind of like where you freeze something in plastic. But for some reason, that didn't work, and so his next attempt at turning this into a trophy was to stuff it and make it like taxidermy. Some sources even say that Jerry's wife, Darcy, saw this breast trophy at one point, but she just didn't say anything. Although I don't know how true that is because it was only on a couple of sources. And to dispose of his second victim's body, Jerry did exactly the same thing that he'd done to his first victim, Linda Slawson. He tied a very heavy car engine part to Jan's body, put her in his car, and then drove her out to that exact same bridge in the middle of the night and threw her body over the side into the river. Meanwhile, of course, Jan's friends and family have already noticed that she's gone missing, and so they reported this to police, and an investigation began. Jan's car was actually found in a parking lot. Of course, not where she left it. When police found it, it was fully working, and it was locked. So it seemed as though Jan had literally just driven there, parked her car, gotten out, locked it, and disappeared from that point. There was no blood, there was no smashed glass, there was, everything about this car seemed normal. So this worried police. It seemed as though Jan had parked there, everything had been normal, and then something had happened to her while she'd been out that day, because this car seemed as though she intended on coming back to it. But not only that, this was now the second girl that had gone missing in that general area where there'd been absolutely no sign of their disappearance. There'd been no clues, there'd been no suspects, just two young women that had disappeared. In March of the following year, 1969, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker was home for spring break. She was trying to fit as much family time into her short vacation as she possibly could before she went back to school. She was studying to become a doctor, she had all the brains and beauty any girl her age could want, she came from a very wealthy family, and she just had a really bright future ahead of her. On March 27th, Karen planned to meet her mother at a Myers & Briggs department store in Salem, Oregon for some lunch. However, she failed to turn up. Her mother waited for her for a while in this restaurant, but when it became clear that maybe Karen had forgotten about the plans or just done something else, her mother began calling around all her friends to see if any of them knew where she was. She called around all of her home friends, no one knew, so then she decided to call around her university friends. Even though her university wasn't in the area, maybe Karen had decided to go back early and just completely forgotten about these plans with her mother. But none of her university friends knew where she was either. None of them had heard from her, nothing. And so her mother went home and informed Karen's father about this. And the two of them decided to go looking for Karen. They went to all of her usual spots that she liked to go to, restaurants, cafes, anywhere. But they just couldn't find any sign of Karen or her car anywhere. It even got to the point where her parents were calling around all the local hospitals to see if maybe Karen had been taken in. Maybe she'd gotten into a car accident, which meant that they wouldn't be able to find her or her car. Neither of them would be accounted for. However, none of the hospitals had any record of her being admitted that day. Within a few days, her family reported Karen Sprinker as missing to the police, and a search began, of course, for both Karen and for her car, because people's cars are often a good indication of where they've been, what they were doing, what they were intending on doing before they went missing. And Karen's car was actually located in the parking lot, in the car park, of that Myers & Briggs department store where she was supposed to meet her mother that day. So it was clear that Karen had arrived and intended on going to that lunch date, but something must have happened from her getting to the car park to getting inside the store. That is a very short window of time. But of course, in a time like this where there's no cameras or anything, it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened to Karen. But of course, we know that Jerry Brudos happened. He'd gone out that day, the first day that he'd actually gone out, intending to find and kidnap and kill a victim. The last two victims were opportunistic. Linda Slawson literally knocked on his front door, and so he took advantage of the moment. Jan Susan Whitney, he was just driving down that road one day when she happened to have broken down on the side of the road, and again, he took advantage of the situation. However, with this one, he'd gotten in his car that day and gone driving specifically looking to abduct a woman. He was driving around Salem, Oregon when he drove past the Myers & Briggs department store, and he saw a beautiful woman in a dress and high heels walking into the store. So Jerry decided that that was it. That was going to be the woman that he was going to abduct and kill that day. So he drove his car around, parked it in the car park, and then went inside the store to go and find this woman. But he just couldn't find her. He couldn't find her again anywhere. He was looking for a while, but then eventually decided to give up and go back to his car to go and find another victim. However, as he was on his walk out of the department store and back into the car park, that is when he ran into Karen Sprinker. He saw Karen get out of her car and begin approaching the department store. And in that moment, he decided that was going to be his new victim. And so he looked around to see if anyone was there, anyone could see him, and when he realised the coast was clear, he approached Karen. And as he got closer, Jerry produced a gun from his pocket, and he pointed it right at Karen and told her that if she came with him, he wouldn't hurt her. And so Karen did as she was told. She was terrified. She was being threatened with a gun. She was fearing for her life in that moment. But what Karen didn't know was that the gun was fake. Jerry didn't own any guns. But in that moment, she was scared and she did as she was told. She went with Jerry to his car and was never seen again. Jerry drove Karen back to his house, took her into the garage and demanded that she stripped naked for him and tried on his collection of stolen underwear. And as with his other victims, Jerry took photos of Karen in this underwear, but the only difference now is that his victim is alive. The other two women, when he'd been taking pictures of them in the underwear, he'd had to put the underwear on them because they were already deceased at the point that he was dressing them and taking pictures of them. But Karen was alive enduring all of this. And Jerry forced Karen to endure this for hours, just making her get changed and taking pictures of her, making her get changed again. However, once he was bored of this, he tied Karen's arms behind her back, tied a noose around her neck, and attached the other end of that rope to the pulley on his garage roof. Some sources say that Jerry even asked Karen as he put the rope on her neck if it was too tight. And when she said yes, Jerry smiled because that was exactly what he wanted. He then wound the lever on this rope pulley until it was getting tighter and tighter and lifting Karen higher and higher off the ground until eventually her feet were no longer on the ground and she was just suffocating from this rope. He left Karen hanging from that rope to die, and when he was sure that she was dead, he pulled her body down from this rope and committed necrophilia on her multiple times for the rest of that evening. Even when his wife and children came home, he was just in the garage, just a few doors away from them, committing necrophilia on a woman's corpse. But as with his other victims, Jerry knew that he couldn't keep her body around no matter how much he wanted to, so instead he decided to take trophies, multiple this time. He cut off both of Karen's breasts and just kind of left them on the side, and in the meantime he decided to pack up the two holes on her chest with brown packing paper. And he later said that he did this because he didn't want to get blood in his car from her two gaping wounds. And once again with his third victim, he did the same routine that he'd done with the first two. He waited until the middle of the night when everyone was asleep. He put the body in his car, tied a very heavy car engine part to it, and then threw her off that same bridge into that same river where his previous two victims were. Meanwhile, Karen's parents have been doing absolutely everything in their power to find their daughter. They've been doing newspaper interviews, public appeals, doing all these different questionings and investigations with the police. They created missing persons posters and put them all over Salem, begging people if they had any form of information, even if they think it's insignificant, to just get in touch with police. And this led to police receiving a very interesting tip from a couple of teenagers who had also been at the Myers & Briggs department store. I don't know if it was on the same day as Karen's disappearance or on a different day, but we do know for sure that it was the exact same car park that this incident took place. They recalled seeing a very tall, large woman in the car park, just in the corner by herself, watching people going about their day, going to their cars, going back to the store, whatever. This woman was wearing a dress and heels and stockings, but she was constantly rearranging her stockings and her dress. She seemed uncomfortable and kind of anxious. And so as the teenagers were leaving the store, they decided to kind of drive over and see what was going on, see if this woman needed help. But as they got closer to this woman, they realised that it wasn't a woman at all. It was a man dressed as a woman. Of course, police couldn't do much with that lead. They didn't have a name, they didn't have a face, they had no more information to go off, but it was just kind of interesting information to hold in mind, maybe for later on. Just 1 month after the murder of Karen Sprinker, Jerry sets out to find yet another victim in April of 1969. You can see how these murders are getting more and more frequent. At first, there was kind of a year-long gap between the first and the second, and now there's just a month-long gap. The satisfaction that he gets from a new kill is wearing off a lot quicker, and so he wants the rush again. Well, I say that, but the rush that Jerry gets from these murders isn't actually from the murder at all. It's from the power that he has over these women, from the intimidation. He wants to scare women, as well as the necrophilia. That's a complete other part to it. Jerry Brudos doesn't commit murder to murder. He commits murder for the byproduct of it, which is the dead body. That's what he wants from this. He does enjoy the build-up. He enjoys, intimidating the woman, seeing the fear in her eyes. But ultimately, the main reason that he's doing this is for the dead body at the end. Because he gets ultimate sexual satisfaction from necrophilia. From having sex with an unresponsive body. On April 23rd of 1969, Jerry Brudos went to a local university's car parking unit to go and look for his next victim. His last attack, he'd picked up the woman in a car parking unit, and so I think he looked at that and thought, okay, well, I'll just do that again. Since it obviously worked the first time, it's going to work a second time. He spotted 24-year-old Sharon Wood leaving the university where she worked as a secretary and making her way to the car parking unit. Sharon was a mother of 2 and currently going through a divorce to her husband of 7 years. And that's actually where she was going that day. She was going to a meeting about this divorce. On her walk to the car park, Sharon suddenly began feeling very anxious, very uneasy, as if something was wrong, something was off. And then she began hearing footsteps behind her. And so she starts walking faster. She's speeding up. She decides not to go up the dark stairwell in the car park. Instead, she decided to go through the main entrance, kind of where the cars would go, because it's a lot bigger, it's a lot brighter, there's more light there. And it was as she was just entering this car parking unit that she felt a tap on her shoulder. And so she turns around, and there, looking her straight in the eyes, is Jerry Brudos. Immediately, Sharon knew that she was in danger before Jerry had even said anything. And Jerry proceeds to do the exact same thing to Sharon that he'd done to Karen a month prior. He got out this fake gun from his pocket and told Sharon to follow him to his car and he wouldn't hurt her. But Sharon wasn't the type to give in so easy. Sharon screamed no at Jerry and turned round to go back out the way that she'd came in, through that main entrance of the car park. But before she could, Jerry pounced on her. Jerry put her in a headlock and dragged her to the ground, and Sharon was trying to fight him back and, get him off her, but really, she was a small woman. Her strength was just no match for Jerry's. And so Sharon did the only thing that she really could do in that situation: scream. But of course, Jerry couldn't have that. He couldn't have his victim making noise, because what if someone heard? So he put his hand over her mouth to muffle her screams, and that was when Sharon saw her opportunity. She bit down on Jerry's hand so hard that his hand started bleeding and her jaw just clenched. It must have been out of adrenaline, out of fear, but she couldn't undo her jaw even if she wanted to. And Jerry was doing everything he could to get Sharon's teeth out of his hand. This was excruciating pain for him, and he couldn't do anything until he got her face off his hand. He lifted up his hand, which of course had Sharon's head kind of attached to it, and he began hitting her head off the curb to try and get her to release her jaw, but that wasn't working. It wasn't until a car actually came around the corner in the car park, and seeing the lights or the noise must have kind of shocked Sharon out of it, and she unclenched her jaw. And when she did, Jerry saw his opportunity and he ran away. Luckily, Sharon was able to go to hospital and she was checked over. She was absolutely fine. She had injuries, but they were easily treated, and she was able to report this to police. Police asked Sharon to describe her attacker in as much detail as she possibly could. However, because she'd been hit in the head so many times, and because he'd been behind her for most of this attack, getting her in a headlock and all sorts, she didn't really get a good look at him, and she couldn't really remember him that much. All she could really remember about Jerry was that he was tall, he was broad, he had a really freckly face, and he had red hair. Meanwhile, Jerry Brudos has returned home, and he's disappointed in himself at this failed abduction. This is the first time that he'd ever set out to commit one of these attacks, one of these murders, and failed. And he didn't like that, because this was a power thing for him. For the woman to have overpowered him in a way that time. He didn't like it at all. And so he wasted absolutely no time in going back out there and finding yet another victim. He actually went out the very next day. And that day, he came across 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith as she was walking by some railway tracks in Salem. And notice how he's gone for a significantly younger victim here. There's almost a decade difference between his previous victim, Sharon Wood, and this one, Gloria Jean Smith. Possibly because his confidence was knocked after his failed abduction, and he knows that if he goes for a smaller, younger victim, they're going to be more scared, they're going to be less likely to physically overpower him, and, you know, he has a higher chance of this being a successful attack. He noticed Gloria heading towards the railway tracks, and so Jerry ran ahead and hid in a bush and waited for her to approach so that he could get out and attack. However, Jerry didn't time it quite right. He jumped out of this bush and tried to run and grab Gloria, but she quickly realised what was going on and turned and ran the opposite way, and Jerry couldn't catch her in time. Once again, another failed abduction. And this was 2 in a row now, and Jerry's confidence is severely knocked. And so he decides to go back to the drawing board and think about what's not working for him and what he needs to do differently. And so once again, the very next day, 3 days in a row now, Jerry Brudos goes out looking for his 4th murder victim. This time, employing some new tactics. On that day, 22-year-old Linda Saley was out at her local mall shopping for a present for her boyfriend. She parked her car on the 6th floor of the car parking unit at the mall and went inside to do her shopping. So once again, Jerry Brudos is particularly targeting car parking units, possibly because it's not a place that many people really hang around. You kind of go there, park your car and leave, or you come back to your car and leave. No one's ever really stood around a car parking unit. Jerry noticed Linda in the car parking unit. She was very short, very petite, just a very small woman, and that's exactly what Jerry was looking for. Someone physically smaller than him that he could overpower, someone that probably wasn't strong enough to fight back. And so Jerry decided to wait in that car parking unit for Linda to return. As she came back out of the shopping mall, Jerry approached her. However, this time he wasn't using that fake gun to intimidate her, as he'd done the past few times. This time, he got out a fake police badge. He told Linda that he was a police officer working on the case of a serial shoplifter at that mall. And Linda happened to fit the description of the suspect perfectly. And so he was going to need her to come back to the police station for questioning. Of course, Linda knew she was innocent. She offered to give Jerry all of her receipts to prove that she'd bought everything on her that day. However, Jerry insisted that she come for a questioning, and so Linda complied. She followed Jerry back to his car and got in the back seat, and the two of them drove in silence back to the police station that turned out to be Jerry Brudos' home. When they arrived on Jerry Brudos' driveway, Linda was still silent. She never said a word, and Jerry Brudos ordered her to step inside his garage. And of course, at this moment, she's probably realising that he wasn't a police officer. The car wasn't marked, he wasn't wearing a uniform or anything. All he had was a badge, and he'd taken her back to a random house that was not a police station. But she was probably very scared, realising that she was now alone with this random man that had lied to her to get her alone. She was very scared. And so she did as she was told. She stepped into the garage in silence. Once she was in there, Jerry Brudos tied her hands behind her back and then left her in that garage alone to go and have dinner with his family. And when he returned, Linda had freed herself from her ties. She'd managed to get her hands untied, but she was still sat in that exact same seat that she was in when Jerry left her. She hadn't tried to leave through the garage door, which was open. She hadn't tried to call anyone using the phone that was in the garage. And there's two possible explanations for this. Maybe she'd only just managed to free her hands and she was going to try escape or call for help, but she just didn't get time. Or maybe this was just such a deep fear reaction that her mind just went blank and she was too scared to even try to escape, because maybe if she stayed and did as she was told, she would stay alive. But if he caught her trying to escape, maybe that was when she would lose her life. Either way, she just sat there. She'd undone her hands, but she was still sat there in that chair. And so when Jerry got back, he still did everything to Linda that he was planning to do. As he'd done with his previous victim, Karen Sprinker, he tied a rope around Linda's neck and attached it to the rope pulley on his garage roof. He then slowly turned the lever on this rope pulley until it was lifting her off the ground and her feet were no longer touching the floor. And then he left her there to die. Once he was sure that Linda was dead, he took her body down from the rope, and as he'd done with all of his previous victims, he committed repeated necrophilia on her body. However, this time, instead of taking a trophy from her body before he disposed of the rest of it, he decided that he was going to perform some kind of experiment on her body. See, Jerry Brudos was quite an amateur scientist. He liked to do certain chemical reactions in his garage. This was before he began abducting and murdering women, but he'd always been someone that always had projects going on in the garage, which is what made this whole thing seem less weird when he was spending so much time in the garage away from his family and didn't want them in there. It's because he'd often done experiments with harmful chemicals and things like that. He did a lot of work with resin, which can be poisonous, so his family knew not to go in the garage. But he hadn't done any experiments for quite a while up until the murder of Linda Saley. He decided to insert 2 large needles into the sides of her rib cage and send a large electric shock through her body to see if he could make her body jump. Although this didn't work out exactly how Jerry had planned, it just kind of burnt her flesh around the needles on either side, didn't make her body flinch in any way. And so Jerry, disappointed with how this experiment had gone, he decided to just dispose of her body the same way that he'd disposed of all of his other victims. Although this time he decided not to take a trophy. He wasn't gonna cut off her breasts or anything as he'd done with his previous victims, because to him, Linda Saley's breasts were, and I quote, too pink. So instead he just tied a very heavy car part to her body, went out in the middle of the night and threw her body over the side of the bridge into the river. Now, throughout this whole case, police had been looking for these 4 missing women. They'd all been reported as missing by their friends and family. However, police just didn't have very many leads. And Jerry hadn't even been suspected once. He wasn't linked to any of the women. His name hadn't even come up once. He was barely even known to police. Yes, he'd done a few things in his younger years when he'd abducted that woman and he assaulted the other woman. Very serious things. But he hadn't done anything in his adult life. And so police had kind of forgotten about Jerry Brudos, and it was looking as though Jerry Brudos was gonna get away with his serial murders. That was until 2 weeks after the murder of his final victim, Linda Saley. Her body had floated to the top of the river. It was spotted by a fisherman who reported it to police, and police came and recovered the body, and then within 2 days of that happening, another body floated to the top of the river. This time, it was Jerry's 3rd victim, Karen Sprinker. Her body was found just 50 feet away from where Linda's was found. And the similarities between both of these cases, both of these dead bodies, were just astounding to police. 2 young girls, both very similar in age, both clearly murdered. This was clearly a homicide. They'd been tied to car engine parts and thrown in the same river. To police, this was a no-brainer that these 2 were connected. And the similarities only grew when the bodies were taken in for autopsy, and their causes of death were both found to be the exact same thing: asphyxiation. On a closer look at the ropes used to tie the women to their respective car parts, police realised that the style of knot used to tie these ropes were the exact same on both women. of course, further adding to their theory that these two murders were connected. But not only that, this style of knot was a very specific, intricate style of knot commonly used by electricians. And this gave police a little bit more information about perhaps the kind of person that their killer could be. Maybe they were an electrician or a former electrician. So at this point in the investigation, police have only found 2 of the 4 bodies in that river. So to them, it's a double murder, not a serial killer. However, due to the nature of how these women's bodies were found, they believe that this probably was a serial killer. They were just yet to find the other bodies. And so divers were sent into this river to search for potentially more bodies. And these searches took a full 2 weeks because they had to search quite a big chunk of the river in case bodies had moved with the currents and things. And this case was very big news. It was being reported all over the state, all over surrounding states as well. This was huge front page news. But Jerry Brudos didn't seem put off by this investigation in the slightest. He was still being the same creep he'd always been, stalking women, following women. And at this point in the case, he particularly liked going to the university and watching the women's dorm rooms, watching the windows. He would just sit outside, sit in the bushes and just spy on the dorm rooms for hours every night, sometimes even calling the dorm room numbers to try to speak to some of the women. And Jerry had this tactic. Every time he wanted to call one of the dorm rooms, he'd call a different one every time and say like, oh, can I talk to Elizabeth? Now, he didn't know an Elizabeth. He didn't even know if an Elizabeth lived in there. But Jerry would just hope for the best and hope that there was an Elizabeth in that room and that the woman on the other side of the phone would be like, oh yeah, let me just go get her. Of course, this tactic didn't work for him most of the time. If the woman on the other side of the phone said, oh, Elizabeth doesn't live here, he'd just be like, oh, sorry, wrong number. However, this method did work quite a few times, and he ended up getting through to quite a few girls in these dorm rooms. And when he would get onto the phone with these girls, he would just make small talk for a while, which I don't know how this worked. These girls were answering the phone to a complete stranger who called specifically for them, but they don't know who it is. And when they answer the phone, he just starts making small talk. I imagine that must have been very confusing for these women. He would tell these women that he was a Vietnam War veteran. He would tell them all these fake stories about all of his experiences in the war. And then he would ask them out on dates. And unbelievably, this actually worked a few times. Women accepted his invitation for dates. A few of the dates ended up falling through, of course, because the women had no idea who this man on the phone was. They just kind of said yes and then changed their mind later on. But one woman in particular went through with it. He met this woman on site at her university and they went on this date. They were just kind of walking around campus and all he seemed to talk about was his own murders. Of course, these 2 bodies being found in a river was huge news in that area. It was all people in Salem were talking about. So this wasn't particularly odd that they were talking about that. Of course, a first date is never really a time to be talking about murder. But, you know, if it's current news at the time, it makes sense. And everyone was terrified, especially young women who were the same age, the same kind of victim profile as the 2 women that were found. This woman was terrified. And she had no idea that she was talking to a serial killer. But like I said, this was current news. It was big news as well. So this woman didn't think much of it at first. But as this date was going on, Jerry Brudos was acting weirder and weirder. So much so to the point that when he left, this woman actually called police because she was freaked out by Jerry. She told police on the phone that when Jerry was there, he'd offered to give her a back massage, which she accepted. However, once he started doing it, he told her to act sad while he was doing it. Even telling her, and I quote, think about those 2 girls that were found in the river. That was an awful thing that happened to them. He was trying to make her genuinely sad while he gave her a massage. Very odd. Of course, this woman told police how Jerry kept bringing up the murders throughout the date, even asking her just before he left, why she'd actually agreed to meet up with him that day. He even told her, well, how did you know I was going to bring you home safely? How did you know that I wasn't going to take you out to the river, strangle you, and throw you in? So police thought that this was a lead worth looking into, and so they asked this woman to describe this man that she'd been on a date with in as much detail as she possibly could. She said that he was large, red-headed, and freckly. And as soon as police heard that description, heard those 3 key words, they knew that this was the person that they were looking for in this investigation. Thinking back to those 2 failed abductions of Sharon Wood in the car parking unit and 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith at the railway, when both of these women reported their attacker to the police, they also described him as large, red-headed, and freckly. So could this be the Salem serial killer out looking for his next victim? Perhaps those 2 failed abductions had been failed murder attempts, and maybe this was his next victim, this girl at the university. To find out, police told all the women at this university that if they received another phone call from this Vietnam War veteran, that they stall him on the phone for as long as they can and call police to the scene immediately. Around a week or so later, on May 25th, 1968, Jerry Brudos once again calls that girl that he'd been on a date with a week prior. He just said to this woman, like, hey, I'm in the area right now. Do you fancy going on a second date? I can be with you in around 15 minutes. So the girl agreed, but she said she was going to need a little bit more time to get ready, and she told him to come and meet her at her uni dorm in about an hour, giving her plenty of time to get the police there before Jerry got there. So police arrived at her kind of dorm reception room. I don't quite understand the layout of this dorm, but anyway, there was quite a large reception room apparently with like bulletin boards and stuff. Police got there as quickly as they could anyway, and they waited for Jerry to arrive, and as soon as he did, they approached him. They told him that they just wanted to ask him a few questions, and they said that they were doing this to everyone on campus due to the recent murders, just so that Jerry didn't suspect that they were suspecting him. They asked him, of course, the basic things: his name, his address, what he did for a living. He said his name was Jerry Brudos, gave his address, and he said that he was an electrician for a radio station. And they also asked him why he was at the university that day, and Jerry said that he was actually in the area because he was helping a friend work on his garden. However, the friend wasn't home yet, and so to kill about an hour or 2, Jerry had just gone to the university and was just having a look around. And immediately, this was a red flag to police, because why had this man just lied about his reason for being at the university? They knew that he was there for a date with this girl, not that he was helping a friend with his garden. So now, not only did he fit the description of the potential abductor, he was now acting suspicious too. That, on top of the fact that he just told police that he was an electrician, and his just general creepy behaviour, this meant that they suspected him way more than they did originally. But no matter how much they suspected him in that moment, they couldn't arrest him because they had no physical evidence or, this was the first time they'd met this man. This was the first time they'd heard his name. It didn't make sense to arrest him on the spot then and there. They needed more evidence. So police said thank you for your time, and they let Jerry go. And as soon as they did, he left the university. He didn't stick around and meet this girl for this date, because if he would have done, that'd have been way too bait. Police would have known that he lied about his reason for being there, even though they already knew, but Jerry didn't know they knew. I don't know if that makes sense, but if he would have stayed and gone on this date, he would have looked even more suspicious to police. So, his best bet was to just leave and try not to incriminate himself any further. So police officers went back to the police station and ran his name through the database. This was the first time they had a name in this case. They'd had so many leads, but just no specific suspects that they could properly look into. So they ran his name, Jerry Brudos, on the database, and his previous criminal history came up. Those 2 assaults that he'd committed in his teen years that landed him in the psychiatric ward for 8 months. They were also able to find a record of Jerry Brudos's addresses at every point in his life. So every time he'd moved home, this had been logged, his new address had been logged. And it seemed that each of these very suspicious disappearances of these 4 women happened very close to Jerry. No matter where he was, whenever he moved home, a woman would go missing in that area. And then when he moved back to Salem, women started going missing there as well. For example, the first murder of Linda Slawson, the encyclopedia saleswoman, they knew roughly what neighbourhood Linda had gone missing from because her sales company had the record of where she was supposed to be selling that night. They didn't have the exact house, unfortunately. However, they did have that general area. And Jerry Brudos lived in that area at the time of her disappearance. They also found that Jerry's current home in Salem, Oregon was just a few miles away from the river where the bodies had been found. And Jerry actually drove over that bridge above the river to get to work every day. So that was a bridge and a river that he knew well. And this was suspicious enough for police to want to go and have a chat with Jerry Brudos, just about the missing women in the area. They weren't acting too suspicious of him right now, because if they did, he was going to try to flee. So they were just kind of acting as though they wanted a bit of information from a local. In this questioning, police once again brought up the fact that Jerry Brudos was an electrician, just to confirm that for their records. And Jerry talked about how he'd been an electrician for several different radio stations since his early 20s, so almost a decade he'd been doing that job. And that was very important for police, that they spoke to him about that in a bit more detail, because if you remember what I said about the knots on the ropes that were found on the women's bodies, they had a very specific style of knot that was commonly used among electricians. Not only that, but one of the officers that was doing this questioning decided to get up and have a bit of a walk around Jerry's home. This wasn't an official search, it was just him having a walk around, seeing if he could see anything suspicious on any of the sides or anything. And this officer went into Jerry Brudos's garage and found a length of rope with that exact style of electrician knot in it. Now, at this point in the case, after this very suspicious questioning, police decided to go all out and get search warrants for Jerry Brudos's cars. On May 28th, 1969, Jerry Brudos's cars were searched. However, nothing was found. But, of course, anyone that's trying to hide evidence, anyone that's done anything criminal in their car is, of course, gonna bleach every square inch and meticulously clean it just in case it's searched. Police eventually gave up the search of the cars when they realised they weren't really going to find anything, and they went back to the police station feeling quite defeated. They thought that they were going to find something in one of those cars that meant that they could arrest Jerry. Police knew that they had to do something though, because they suspected this man so much that they thought they had the serial killer. And the whole time that he wasn't arrested and wasn't in police custody, he was a danger and he could be killing other people. They had to do something. So in the meantime, police decided that they were going to stage a stakeout mission on Jerry Brudos's home. They were going to have an undercover police officer outside 24/7 watching the premises, mainly to see if Jerry was leaving and coming back and, bringing people back or putting suspicious things in his car, And on May 30th, so just 2 days after his cars were searched, it seems that those search warrants had scared Jerry Brudos a little bit, because on that day, he packed up his car, packed all his family into his car, and began driving north. Luckily, the officers in the stakeout car saw this happening, and so they were able to contact police back at the station, and they all set out to track down Jerry Brudos and his family. Alerts were sent out to police departments all over that side of America. They were sent out to state borders just in case Jerry was going to try and pass over into the Canadian border. Later that day, Jerry Brudos's car was tracked down on an interstate heading to the Canadian border. So police were right about the theory that Jerry was going to try to flee the country. They tracked down the car, they pulled them over, and they went to arrest Jerry Brudos. But when they got to the car, he wasn't in there. Darcy was driving the car. The 2 children, his son and daughter, were sat in the back of the car, And Jerry wasn't in there. There was no one else in there. That was until one of the officers turned on a flashlight and shone it on the ground of the back seats, kind of in the footwell, and they saw a big lump under a blanket. And of course, this blanket lump was Jerry Brudos, and police were able to arrest him then and there. Jerry was taken into police custody, and when he got to the police station, he was strip searched. And as they asked him to undress, they realised that Jerry Brudos was wearing women's underwear. Now, I can't say for sure that it was stolen from his victims, but we can probably theorise that this underwear that he was wearing was the underwear of one of the women that he murdered. Once Jerry was in custody, he got that one phone call. You know how inmates get one phone call to someone at home just to kind of tell them what the situation is? Jerry Brudos chose his wife, Darcy. And on this phone call, Jerry told Darcy to burn everything. Burn everything in the garage. All of his collection of stolen underwear, all of his photos, you know, the trophies that he'd taken, the breast molds. It's kind of mad that he didn't think that police would be listening and recording this phone call, but anyway, he said it all anyway. So Jerry was questioned for hours by officers. They were presenting all of this evidence that they had against him, and he was still denying it. That was until around 4 hours in, when Jerry Brudos confessed to all 4 murders. On a search of his home, police found a lot of pictures that Jerry Brudos had taken of his victims, both dead and alive. And they also found a large portion of his stolen underwear collection. It seemed that Darcy hadn't really burned much of it, although she did burn a few things. I don't know why she didn't burn it all, whether it was a case of she just didn't have enough time or whether she kind of felt bad for burning evidence. Either way, police got as much evidence as they needed, really. They didn't need every single thing that Jerry had ever done to say that he was guilty. In his trial, Jerry Brudos attempted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and so a lot of psychiatric evaluations had to take place by many different psychiatrists. However, every single one of these evaluations, he had to be tested by a fair few professionals, but not one of them found a single issue with Jerry's mental state. They found that he was perfectly mentally stable and he was just a cold-blooded killer. In his final trial, Jerry Brudos decided to partially change his plea. He decided to plead guilty to 3 of the 4 murders. And that was because he couldn't actually be charged with the murder of Linda Slawson, the first victim, the encyclopedia saleswoman, because there was no physical evidence that he ever killed her. There was no physical evidence that he'd ever even met this woman, because yes, he did take pictures, but it seems as though those were the pictures that Darcy managed to burn, because they found no link to Linda Slawson in Jerry's life at all. The only evidence that they really had to say that Jerry Brudos killed Linda Slawson was that she was in his neighbourhood selling encyclopedias on the day that she went missing. Jerry is still believed to have murdered Linda Slawson, and he did confess to murdering Linda Slawson and told the whole story that I've told in this video, but he just wasn't charged with it and wasn't found guilty of it. He was, however, found guilty of the other 3 murders, the 3 that he confessed to, and for that, he received 3 consecutive life sentences. And Darcy Brudos was actually also put on trial and charged with being an accessory to the murder of Karen Sprinker. The prosecution just found it very unlikely that Darcy could have been in the house living with Jerry Brudos through all of this, through all 4 of these murders, and not known a thing. Like, how is that possible? She was tried in court, but she was ultimately found not guilty. The court decided that maybe she actually didn't know that Jerry was doing this the whole time. People have their own opinions about that. Let me know what you think down in the comments down below. Do you think she knew that all of this was going on and just wasn't saying anything, or do you think she actually had no idea? Darcy Brudos and the 2 children were actually granted new identities after all of this, and I think they're still alive today and just living their new lives with their new identities while Jerry Brudos rotted in prison. He was particularly targeted by other inmates in jail for, physical abuse, fights, sexual abuse. However, he was weirdly liked among the prison staff. Because he was an electrician, Jerry would be transported to different places in the prison almost every day to help them fix some kind of electrical issue because it was free. And Jerry knew how to do it all. It saved the prison money. And in return for his free labour around the prison, the guards would bring him in women's catalogues. Women's shoe catalogues specifically, because this was Jerry's porn. This was like bringing him in, you know, like Playboy magazine. I don't know, like porn magazines. All his life he'd got off to women's high-heeled shoes, and technically he was allowed that in his cell because it wasn't, you know, it was just a women's catalogue. It wasn't actually porn, but to him it was. On March 26, 2006, at the age of 67, Jerry Brudos passed away in his cell from liver cancer. But yeah, that's about all I have for this case. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, thank you to Care Of for sponsoring this video. If you want to get 50% off of your first month, you can just click the link in the description and use code Eleanor at checkout. Like I said, the masks are now back in stock, and so is the rest of my merch. So if you want to go pick up any of my merch, eleanorneale.shop, link is on screen right now and in the description. Thank you so much to all of my channel members for their continued support with the channel, especially to tier 2 that helped me choose the cases that I cover. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a thumbs up because that really helps me out. If you want to subscribe and see some more content like this, you can click this circle right here. I upload videos all the time. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there'll be a circle right here. You can click that. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be a playlist on screen right here.